Symbols on the top here, we have beds that the line of strike is the same. And that's going to be special in a little bit. But the beds are dipping away from the axis. So that is a fold called an anticline. So I'm going to draw my symbol for an anticline, which is a line up the axis. This is basically the mirror. So a mirror image on either side. That's basically the mirror. And then the symbol is arrows pointing away because the beds are dipping away. So if we were going to draw on a geologic map and you had some parallel bands of rock like this where you're walking on the surface and you're like, oh, I'm at this blue layer, and then I'm at this green layer, and then I'm at this yellow layer, and oh, geez, I'm at the green layer again? How that? Oh, that's it. And then the blue layer again? What the heck's going on? That means that you crossed over a fold. Great. If you don't have this side image, which you rarely do, you would look at a geologic map and determine that you can tell that the yellow is the oldest rock on this map. And then the green gets a little bit younger and the blue gets younger. So we have the oldest rock exposed in the center and we get progressively younger as we go out to the sides. That tells you it's an anticline, okay? So that's how we know it's an anticlinal fold, even if we can't see this. That's, you know, sometimes you can. Sometimes in a road cut or a nice cliff face, sometimes you can see this side view, but usually you can't. You are just walking on layers of rock at the surface. You're going from this 350 million year old limestone to a 300 million year old sandstone to a 400 million year old, you know, whatever. So you're just going from these layers of rock. Okay, so that's my anticlinal fold where we have beds dipping away from the axis. And I decided to make this a little easier on myself just by making the same structure upside down. So in this case though, this is no longer an anticline. Now we have our beds dipping. Okay, let's look at this one here. So if we're just looking at this, which direction are the beds dipping? To your left or to your right? They're dipping to your right, okay? So they're going this way. And on this side, they're going that way. So now the beds are dipping in toward the axis. Same deal. We still have a mirror image, right? I can still just draw a line right up the axis here. Okay? But in this case, I'll draw my strikes right here on the red bed. In this case, the beds are dipping in towards the axis. Just draw it like that. That tells us that we have a syncline. And another reason we could tell that, even if we couldn't see this end view, is that in this case, the white is the youngest beds of rock, with red and orange getting older as we go further and further out. So the youngest beds of rock are exposed in the center. That's how we know it's a syncline. And our symbol for that is going to be arrows pointing inward. All right, so that structure is done. So now we know we have a syncline on this end. And by the way, if it's a syncline on this end, it's also a syncline on this end. It's not going to flip and do anything really crazy. Not yet. We'll get to Pennsylvania in a little bit where things get really crazy. But with just your simple folds, that's all we're dealing with. Also, it's important to know that on the sides, and that this would be accurate, the beds are just horizontal. They're not going anywhere. They're just going horizontal. And we just have parallel beds of rock exposed at the surface. Their ages are different, and that's how we know. That should be the primary way that we know whether it's an anticline or a syncline. But as we go to the sides, the beds are just horizontal. Okay, so before we get into a much more complex fold, I want to talk about what happens when it's three-dimensional. What happens when the beds are not just, when we don't, by the way, remember this is all compression, just like a kitchen, you know, trying to squish your rug in the kitchen, we have compression forming ups and downs, anticline, syncline, anticline, syncline, anticline, syncline. That's how mountains form. But what if you don't just have compression going from two directions? What if it's coming from multiple directions and you get more of a three-dimensional or circular type of structure? That's going to create something called a dome and a basin. So if we have a three-dimensional anticline, so we have compression in all directions and the beds are dipping away from the center. So I'm going to draw my strike, and I'm going to just draw 4, actually, because that might be pretty helpful. And I don't really think there's a symbol for an anticline. It's just that when you kind of have strike and dips that are kind of radial, like the spokes of a bike from one another, that kind of indicates to you, I guess, that it's an anticline. I don't think anticlines really have their own special symbols. I don't know, they might. But by the way, why am I doing this? If we can see the sides and tell that it's an anticline, well, because these are map symbols. So if a geologist was trying to write on a geologic map and indicate to other people, maybe a lot of non-English speaking people, that, hey, this is what these beds are doing underground, and this is the kind of structure we have, then this is what they're using, are these geologic symbols to indicate what's going on underground. So you can't see that. You probably can't see this either. You have a map, bird's eye view of what's happening at the surface, and the map symbols are to help you with that. Okay, so as we go all the way around, we can tell that we have had compression in all directions, creating a geological dome or structural dome. I do want to point out that because these wood blocks are flat on top, that's not just because it was easier that way. That if we have erosion taking place, that is probably what would happen. It would be relatively flat. A structural dome does not mean a high place. These are not necessarily forming hills. In fact, if this yellow layer of rock was a really soft limestone or something, and the blue layer was a really hard sandstone, then even though this is a structural dome, the inside of it would have a divot, and it would be actually lower elevation on the inside than on the outsides if this was nice hard sandstone sticking up. That happens all the time. So just because you have hills and valleys or whatever does not mean that you have domes and basins. Structurally, you probably have something much bigger, much more complex going on than what you may see at the surface. Or actually probably a lot less complex, because this one structure could form a mountain, valley, and other mountains, right? But it's only one structure. Okay, I'm going to turn it over, and we have the same thing over here where we have a three-dimensional or circular syncline. So we have a synclinal fold, or a synclinorium is what they like to call it, and this is called a basin. And once again, we don't have really a symbol for a basin, I don't think, but we know that the beds are all pointing, or all dipping rather, toward the inside. So just like with a syncline, the beds are dipping in toward the axis. At this point, the beds are all dipping in toward the center. Whoopsie. All right, so that's our symbol for a basin. And again, in this case, just like with our syncline, we know the youngest layer, the white in this case, is in the middle, and progressively older and older layers out to the sides. So even if we couldn't see the side view, we still know it's a geological basin because we have younger layers in the middle, older layers to the sides, even though it can look identical to a dome. It's all about the age of the rocks, because we rarely can we see the side here, but we know what the ages of the rocks are. Okay, that's it for that.